Our first panel of today is the ticking time bomb, Khamenei's nuclear ambitions, which will discuss Tehran's nuclear ambitions, recent progress, and the potential consequences of a nuclear-armed Iran. Joining us for this panel are Michael Singh, Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute, Behnam Taleblu, Senior Fellow at FTD, and Matthew Kroenig, Vice President and Senior Director at the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center. Moderating this panel is Afschineh Latifi, an attorney and member of the Mufti Advisory Council. Please welcome our speakers.
Good morning to everyone. Good morning, distinguished panel. Thank you, all of you, for being here. And as you know, our discussion today is the ticking time bomb, Khamenei's nuclear ambitions. At the outset, I wanted to say that, Mike, I understand you may have to leave a little bit earlier, so we're going to get all of our important questions to you out early so we can get your insight into everything. I want to start out with Behnam, though. Behnam, you and your colleagues at the FTD have recently published a monograph entitled Deterring Iran's Dash to the Bomb, where in addition to laying out a series of steps that the regime could take that would make its program even more dangerous before actually developing a nuclear weapon, you discuss about the successful past deterrent acts we've taken, as well as lessons the U.S. would need to heed if it wants to successfully deter Iran in the future. Can you share some of those lessons with us?
Absolutely, and I'll try to be brief because I know this is an area that both Mike and Matt have looked at as well. But thank you for the question, and thank you to Mufti for the invitation and for doing everything that you do to keep Iranian Americans in the fight. It's appreciated very much, not just in this town, but across this country. So thank you. To a slightly more technical question, the Islamic Republic has only backed down a handful of times in its history. The problem is we can all count them on one hand, probably. The ending the Iran-Iraq war or agreeing to the JCPOA nuclear deal. There's a whole host of tactical things that we've done in the region to get them to back down, but one tool of success is actually calling it out as you see it. You know, just like the rule of the New York City subway, if you see something, say something. It's called deterrence by detection. You basically put a spotlight on some kind of activity that the Iranians think is secret or is illicit, and by merely calling it out, you can thwart it, you can generate more pressure, you can develop sunk costs for it, and 9 times out of 10, the Iranians will think they have a safe pathway. Once they come up and meet the limelight, they'll have to go down and find a new way to innovate. And the reason I say they'll have to find a new way to innovate is that this is a regime that has had, unfortunately, a relatively consistent foreign and security policy for the past 45 years. The quest for the ultimate weapon is not a science fair program. It's a quest, really, for the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism to get a nuclear weapon. And that's why the other element that has worked time and time again is strength, and more importantly, consistent strength. Only when faced with the option of there being no way out but through can you get to a situation that you had at the end of the Iran-Iraq war, where for the purpose of regime survival, for the purpose of expediency, and we can debate the utility of even offering these guys regime survival at a certain point, but only then will they ever take the knee and, in their own parlance, drink from the poison chalice or drink from the cup of poison. So if there is a new administration looking for a new kind of art of the deal, if you will, I think the idea of nuclear diplomacy with the Islamic Republic really should be pushed away. But if this is still going to come back to the front burner, the idea of pushing on these guys from a position of strength and continuing that strength. And again, because we mentioned the Iran-Iraq war, small historical anecdote many have missed in this town, is that 3 times during the end of the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign, you had Iranian officials say that the 1.5 years of unilateral economic sanctions was more damaging to them than the 8-year Iran-Iraq war. One time President Rouhani said it, at least 2 to 3 times Iran's then oil minister, Mr. Zanganeh, said it. So even though in this town, for some reason, that policy is treated with a stigma, we should be, not putting words in the mouths of Iranians and looking to see what they fear and amplifying those fears. But I have to tell you, so long as this regime is in power, I think it's going to be pursuing this ultimate weapon.
Okay. Mike, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, let me first say it's a real pleasure to be here with all of you. I always find it funny when I'm described as an Iran expert, as Cameron did. I've never been to Iran. You guys are the Iran experts, and it's a real pleasure to have a chance to sit here with you. I think that those of us who work on Iran policy, it's tremendously benefited from the engagement of the Iranian American community, because we need to learn from you, frankly. Look, Behnam's answer was correct, and I think that when we talk about Iran's pursuit of a nuclear weapon, it's important that we understand that for this regime, they're pursuing nuclear weapons not as some sort of lark, but because it makes sense as part of their national security strategy. I don't say it makes sense in an approving way, but look at what's happening in the region right now. Iran tried to strike Israel in mid-April using a conventional strike, about 300 drones, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and so forth. It was completely ineffective. It was humiliating, in fact, because not only did they not succeed in significantly damaging their targets, but most of the projectiles didn't get through because a coalition of the United States and other countries in the region stood together against Iran. And this is what Iran faces. It faces a coalition of countries which all stand against it, which all oppose this regime, and who are determined to counter its efforts in the region. That will only underscore for the regime that given that conventional weakness, given that they have no friends in the region, except for maybe Bashar al-Assad and some proxies, that will, I think, redouble their determination to get nuclear weapons because of the fear that they should have, frankly, of this coalition that's arrayed against them. And the idea that often underpins our diplomacy, I'm not against diplomacy, by the way, I want to say that from the outset. The idea that often underpins our diplomacy, I think, taken out of international relations classroom, and I don't say that as an insult to Matt, but is that somehow we can offer the regime through diplomacy, through negotiations, security assurances. Personally, I don't think there's anything we could possibly say to the Iranian regime that would make them feel secure in the face of all that they face against them in the Middle East. I don't think there's anything we could say in the context of negotiations that would make them feel as though, any American president, Republican or Democrat, is simply going to stand by and not do anything while they pursue the strategy they're pursuing in the Middle East. Therefore, they want nuclear weapons. The way, I think, to stop them, the way, I think, to get them to reconsider is to make them worry about the cost of pursuing nuclear weapons. And that's what Behnam is talking about. The cost, yes, in terms of reputation, but the cost directly. To make them worry that, in fact, the cost will be so high that they won't succeed to get nuclear weapons. Because either we'll impose damaging sanctions, or we might even intervene militarily to stop them. I don't think the regime right now is convinced that that's the case. And to me, that's a real problem, and that's why you see them pushing forward so vigorously with their nuclear program.
Thank you. And just to follow up on that, Behnam, I understand that Iran has enriched uranium up to 60%, if possibly not more. And the IAEA has reported that Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium is now more than 18 times the limit set by the JCPOA. How does this level of enrichment impact the timeline that for Iran developing a nuclear weapon? And what can the international community, what should the response be from the international community, especially now with the United States being so focused on its own elections and Israel involved with Hezbollah and Gaza and having their hands tied? What do you think the international community, how should they react to that?
Well, I'll also try to be brief because this would be another great point to have Mike and Matt on as well. But listen, the Islamic Republic has not just gone to 60%, which is something they've threatened to do a decade ago, but only felt comfortable doing in April 2021. Ironically, that was the same month that the Biden administration began its indirect nuclear diplomacy via the Russians in Vienna with the Islamic Republic to resurrect the nuclear deal. Khamenei had talked about nuclear propulsion for nuclear-powered submarines that they don't even have back in 2011, 2012, if you remember. But even last February, they went to 84% purity briefly. They didn't razor's edge away from pure weapons-grade uranium. And you don't even need pure weapons-grade uranium to drop a nuclear weapon. By the way, the US, the only country in the world that has actually used nuclear weapons, dropped 2 in the end of World War II in Japan, 1 uranium, 1 plutonium. The US didn't even test the uranium version, and the uranium that it did drop was reportedly enriched to only 80% purity. So newsflash, the Islamic Republic has gone to 83, 84% last February and come back down. It's a huge problem. The growing stockpile, the more centrifuges, all this diminishes the breakout timeline. The problem is if you have the philosophical preset that the current administration has, which is at best to manage the problem, you all know the military is saying the problem ends up managing you. It ends up constraining and limiting the Biden administration's approach, and you get this fundamentally reactive posture. So I think step number 1 is you have to play offense and put the Iranians on defense. I do think snapback can be the beginning of a much larger conversation. I think snapback would have been ideal when the Iranians went to 60%. It definitely would have been ideal when they went to 83%. But getting a broad baseline diplomatic pressure policy in place that from there allows you to respond to the next Iranian steps in concert with your European partners, that needs to be step number 1. And because there is no broad multilateral understanding as to what we have to do, I think we've all kind of been adrift. The US, as you see at the IAEA in Vienna, has barely even been issuing these resolutions of censure. They haven't referred Iran's file to the Security Council. And by the way, this is a tool, if you're interested in avoiding war, or at least marshaling every bit of diplomatic and economic pressure before, God forbid, having to go to a conflict. This is a tool you want to exhaust, and the UN Security Council will be a tool we will no longer have against the Islamic Republic after October 2025, because Russia's quite keen on playing the role of Iran's lawyer there. And this is, again, a big worry, and it will confront whoever is president after January.
Thank you. Matt, did you want to add to that?
Well, first, I'd just say it's an honor to be here, and thank you very much for all you do and for organizing this important conference. And like Mike, I'm sometimes described as an Iran expert, but I've never been to Iran, but I have been working on U.S. policy toward Iran for more than 20 years now. And I'm kind of depressed because Iran, I've been working for 20 years to try to stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons, and now it's closer than it's ever been. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken has said that Iran's dash time to producing 1 bomb's worth of fissile material is now down to 1 or 2 weeks. Some people try to console themselves and say, well, it would be additional time, maybe a year to actually build a bomb, additional time to put it on a missile. And that's true, but I think once they get 1 bomb's worth of fissile material, essentially the game's over, because they could move that material, put it in places where we couldn't reach it. And so I think once they get there, Iran becomes a nuclear power. And I think that's also depressing for what it means for the future of democracy and human rights in Iran. If the Islamic Republic is armed with nuclear weapons, I think it makes it much harder for the international community to affect developments in terms of regime in Iran. And also, I think, maybe helps the regime to hold on to power domestically. So I'm worried where we are. And I don't think we have a strategy right now. The United States and its allies, I don't think we have a strategy for stopping Iran from building nuclear weapons. The Biden administration came in with the idea that they were going to get back into the Iran nuclear deal, use that as a baseline to negotiate a longer, stronger deal. And that hasn't worked. Iran hasn't agreed to that. And there's really no plan B that I can see. I think the administration has essentially been hoping that this doesn't blow up before the election, and so I hope that a Harris administration or a Trump administration will put in place a serious plan to stop Iran's program. But I'm depressed.
Thank you. And just to follow up on that, when you say Harris or Trump administration, and this is open to all 3 of you, do you guys feel like with the issue of nuclear weapons, will, depending on which administration comes to power in January, do you think it makes a difference, Harris or Trump?
Well, of course it's going to make a difference. We'll see different policies from a Harris administration than we will from a Trump administration. But my worry is different from that. I sort of join Matt in being a little bit depressed about this issue, because I worry that we as a national security establishment have largely given up on this and moved to a sort of more containment-oriented mindset. Because at the end of the day, as I said, look, I think that if we're going to really stop the Iranian regime from obtaining nuclear weapons, they're going to have to worry a lot about what our response would be to their effort to get to that threshold that Matt talked about. But what do you hear in Washington these days? You hear basically Middle East fatigue, which is only going to be worse now after the last year's events. You hear worries that we don't, in fact, even have the capability, the munitions, the forces to take on more than one threat at a time. And the idea that we really need to prioritize the Indo-Pacific, Asia, which is not wrong from a strategic standpoint. But on the other hand, no real effort to do anything to address those deficiencies, to increase military spending, to put ourselves in a position where we could address threats in Europe, in the Middle East, in the Indo-Pacific at the same time. And if it comes down to a choice between needing to deter China and needing to deter Iran, I worry that the choice will be China. And at the end of the day, our willingness to intervene militarily, our willingness to pose a credible threat so that we don't ultimately need to either intervene or accept an Iranian nuclear weapon, I see very little willingness to do that on any side in Washington these days. I see instead a sort of a hope for silver bullets, whether that's a diplomatic silver bullet or a sanctioned silver bullet. But I don't see a real willingness to take this problem head on. I think it's a big mistake, not just a big mistake when it comes to nuclear proliferation or just security in the Middle East, but in terms of our global strategy. Because as I think you've had another panel discuss, I don't think we can separate the challenges of Iran, Russia, and China. Whether you want to call it an axis or whether you simply see them pursuing sort of mutual interests in a sort of marriage of convenience, as I look at that group arrayed against us, Iran is the weakest of those three and the most susceptible to pressure, and yet that's where I think we're least likely right now to be applying that pressure.
Okay, thank you. And so all three of you have touched on the issue of sanctions and whether they've been effective or they haven't been, and how Washington feels about it. But Iran has continued to make progress in its nuclear program. How effective do you guys think sanctions have been in curbing that, and what other measurements can we take in addition to sanctions?
Sure, I'll jump in here. And you asked about would Harris or Trump have a different approach? I think they would. And what I'd recommend to both of them is I do think that we should be clear about what the goal is. I think a good strategy starts with clear goals. And I think the goal should be to get Iran to give up its enrichment program altogether. And I think sometimes people don't understand this, but if Iran really wants a peaceful nuclear energy program, there's no need for it to have its own enrichment program. The vast majority of countries on Earth, Mexico, United Arab Emirates, Vietnam, others with peaceful nuclear programs, don't make their own fuel. They have the fuel provided to them by other countries. That's something we've offered to Iran for 20 years, and they've always refused. And so I think that's one piece of evidence that this isn't just a peaceful energy program, it is a bomb program. So I think we should insist on zero enrichment. And essentially have a pressure and engagement strategy, which is what Obama did, I think is what Trump did, and I think going back to something like that makes sense, and say if you're willing to come to the table, if you're willing to talk about giving up enrichment in exchange for sanctions relief, for help with getting nuclear fuel, we're willing to do that. But so long as you continue on this path, we're going to make life difficult with tougher sanctions. I agree with Mike. I think the military option needs to be on the table because I don't think the Islamic Republic wants a military conflict with the United States. And so if we have a credible military option on the table, I think that's something that would stop them from dashing to a bomb. And so to directly answer your question, then I think sanctions do play a role. They're not a silver bullet. They're not going to do it on their own. But I think that they need to be a component of a broader pressure and engagement strategy.
Mike, on your time constraints, are you okay? Or okay? Let me just hop in here with a footnote to what Matt just said. Listen, the challenge facing the next U.S. administration, you could read it in the tea leaves of the people that came before. Obama, very different than Trump, very different than Biden. But in essence, these three very different people from different political parties had one broad philosophical view that unfortunately exists to some degree in the grassroots, which is that the Middle East, since the Iraq War, since the engagements of the early part of the 2000s in the region, is a junk bond and you have to get out. And you've seen these three very different people engage with the region through that transactional less is more approach. And unfortunately, I believe, should this approach continue into 2025 and into the next administration, it'll definitely water down not just the success of stopping a potential Iranian nuclear weapon, but it'll stop the success of what you guys were talking about all day yesterday, which is trying to push for a peaceful evolution inside that country and to have finally a political order in that country that represents the views, values, and interests of the Iranian people. And that is going to be majorly impeded by the U.S. trying to do less, not more there. And I think it's high time for us to connect the dots. I don't mean this in a disrespectful way to the scholarship of Matt or Mike, who really are masters of this on the counterproliferation side. But I think given how close the Islamic Republic is today, I think step number one, as Matt was just saying, getting your strategy, ways, means, and ends all properly aligned. I think goal number one actually has to be stop the regime. Stopping the bomb has to be a component of stopping the regime. Our problems with the Islamic Republic of Iran did not originate with the nuclear issue. They will not end with the nuclear issue. In fact, the whole world is telling you you have a whole other host of problems that are driving you in a very dangerous direction. And I think it's time we take stock of that. Lest we forget, even before there was a nuclear deal, right? The Europeans actually were to America's right on the nuclear issue. Before the JCPOA, the 2013 interim deal, the European had about 420, this is before the UK left via Brexit, they had about 420 designations on Iran. The US Treasury had about 380, 390. And that was because Europe saw Iran developed 20%, Iran threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz, and the crackdown on the Green Movement in 2009 following, and then 2010. You fast forward to today, you have all of these three vectors on steroids. It's not 20%, it's 60%. It's not the post-Green Movement crackdown, it's the post-Massa crackdown. And it's not threatening to close the Strait of Hormuz or Persian Gulf. It's now been exported to the Red Sea, and the cherry on the sundae is that they're tightening ties with America's great power competitors. Literally, Iranian drones are on 4 different continents today. Iran is basically backing Russia's war against Ukraine. It sees its interests more with America's great power adversaries than ever before. There is a new, I would use the word axis or partnership between Iran, Russia, China, potentially Syria, North Korea, depending on how you count. And our inability to see this coming is going to lead to major policy disasters that will not be quarantined to the nuclear issue. It could lead to a lot of other strategic surprises like 10-7s or Iranian weapons in jurisdictions we didn't think of. And especially if we're talking about defenses, conventional defenses to offset some of these things, we're going to be stretched to push back on Iranian weapons in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, and even as we are today in Europe with the debate over arming Ukraine 2 years after Russia's war there. So I think step number one is actually being the area of convergence for us for so long. Step number one now has to be, given how much foreign aggression there is, given how much domestic suppression there is, given how persistent of a threat this is on the terrorism front, you heard the panel yesterday, on the great power competition front, you have the literature of both these gentlemen in DC, the book, the monograph, the work at WINEP. It's time to connect the dots. Stopping the bomb has to be a component now of stopping the regime. That has to be priority number one. And in that, we need also clarity from Washington, but also to work more hand in hand with the diaspora and with the people of Iran. That has to be priority number one.
Thank you, Behnam. Mike, Iran's nuclear program has led to increased tensions with the neighboring countries. What are the implications of Iran's stockpile for regional security, especially as it pertains to Israel and Saudi Arabia? And how have these tensions affected the broader Middle Eastern geopolitical landscape?
Well, I think there have been severe consequences to Iran's ability to push forward so far on its nuclear weapons program, as well as its activities in the region, in places like Lebanon and Syria and Yemen. And I would point to 3 in particular. Number one, what have we seen from Iran's closest neighbors, like the UAE and Saudi Arabia? Well, first, we have seen a resumption of diplomatic ties between those countries and Iran. And I think that the countries that have done this, the Arab Gulf states that have done this, have done it in hopes that by having normal relations with Iran, by talking with the regime, they can somehow put a ceiling or a cap or a lid on conflict with Iran. And we saw this trend start, frankly, after some Iranian strikes in the region, after the outbreak of war in Yemen, and a feeling, I think, amongst our partners in the region that we, the United States, the West in general, was not going to intervene to help. And so they were essentially on their own. And so that was the first response. The second response we've seen, though, is on the other side, we've seen these states attempting to do things to bolster their own security, which is what we would expect to see them do. And that's taken a number of forms. Saudi Arabia is interested not just in a defense treaty with the United States, but also in its own nuclear program, including the complete fuel cycle on Saudi territory. And those have been advanced discussions now between the United States and Saudi Arabia in that regard. So we've seen them take steps like this. Obviously, they've done other things, such as trying to purchase new weapon systems and so forth. So we see both an effort to put a cap on conflict with Iran, as well as perhaps deter Iran through steps like that. But there's another trend we've seen, which a few scholars like Eric Brewer and others have written about, which I think is also very important. We worry, and many, I think all three of us have probably written about the idea that Iran could become more aggressive, feel greater impunity if it had nuclear weapons. But we actually see the regime already making use of its threshold status, its nuclear weapons threshold status, to act more aggressively and with more impunity in the region. So, Iran will do something in Lebanon or against Israel and so forth, and as we in the West or as our partners in the region are contemplating a response or how to retaliate, the regime will explicitly threaten that any retaliation will bring a crossing of the nuclear weapons threshold, a crossing of the 90% enrichment threshold that Behnam was talking about before. And so we see that even without nuclear weapons, Iran is sort of weaponizing, as it were, its status as a threshold state. This will only get worse as time goes on and as their nuclear capabilities advance and as their regional posture strengthens.
Thank you.
See, you're only clapping now out of sympathy because you clap for Behnam, so I appreciate that, though.
Matt, this is for you. Despite past assessments from U.S. intelligence that the regime in Iran is, I quote, not currently undertaking the key nuclear weapons development activities that would be necessary to produce a testable nuclear device, there's an unclassified assessment that was sent to Congress this past July by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence that said since 2020, Iran has undertaken activities that better position it to produce a nuclear device if it chooses to do so. And yet we hear from the Iranian leaders that this is all peaceful. Is it really peaceful? And how can transparency be ensured to verify the peaceful nature of Iran's nuclear activities?
So I don't think this is a peaceful nuclear energy program. I think it's clearly designed to give Iran a nuclear weapon. And I think it was a mistake for the U.S. government to publicize that Iran has stopped its nuclear weapons activities. Not that it was wrong, but it was confusing. Because when it comes to building nuclear weapons, you essentially have to do three things. The first and most difficult part is producing the fuel, enriching uranium. And Iran has been enriching uranium and is, now has the most advanced enrichment program ever. Again, 1 to 2 weeks dash time. So that should have been the focus all along, the enrichment program. Second, you need the ability to weaponize and to turn it into a warhead. That's true. But that's maybe the easiest stage. The United States didn't even test its first nuclear weapon that it used on Hiroshima. The simple gun type design. It did test the more sophisticated implosion design. But we know that Iran has been working on that in the past. It had shaped charges and other things for an implosion design, so we know they've done work there. And you're right, recent evidence that maybe they've restarted that. And then third and finally, you need the ability to get the weapon to your adversaries. And Iran already has the largest ballistic missile stockpile in the Middle East. It's worked on ICBM technology in the past. So essentially all three pieces are right there. And I think that should be the focus, not this kind of weird technical focus of, do we have evidence that in a back room somewhere they're designing a bomb? I think that's missing the big picture. And the big picture is this has been a 20-year longer than 20-year effort to build nuclear weapons.
And certainly not peaceful.
Right. The purpose of a nuclear weapon, I think, for Iran is deterrence, but also coercion. I agree with Mike that I think a nuclear-armed Iran would be more aggressive, and already, because of this nuclear threshold status, I think we see it being more aggressive in the region. And then I should say, I think there is also a risk of nuclear war. I think sometimes people forget that, but a nuclear-armed Iran might use nuclear weapons, and I don't think it's suicidal, but the United States and the Soviet Union have come close in the past. The U.S. intelligence community estimated that there was a 50-50 chance that Putin would use nuclear weapons in Ukraine in 2022. So it's not just about what a nuclear weapon would mean for coercion or status. I think there is a real risk that Iran could use nuclear weapons. And if they have ICBMs, which is something they've worked on in the past, it could have the ability to deliver nuclear weapons to the United States, which would mean the American people would have to live under the threat of Iranian nuclear attack forever. So that's why, among the many reasons, I think it's important to stop them before they get there.
Thank you.
Afschineh, just one thing on this. I want to say that if you listen to regime officials' own words now, in fact, the way that they're talking about their own intentions is changing, and it's something we need to pay careful attention to. And I think it's actually one of the reasons why our intelligence community's assessments are changing publicly as well, because it's harder to avoid now the conclusion that this may not be, I mean, look, no U.S. Administration for many years has thought this was a peaceful nuclear program. But now, for example, we have Abbas Araghchi today, or yesterday, maybe in New York, talking about his discussions with European officials and others, saying that the atmosphere was one of diplomacy and negotiations, and everyone on the other side realizes that negotiations are the way to ensure that Iran's nuclear program remains peaceful. What he didn't say was, of course Iran's nuclear program will always be peaceful. He basically said, you have to get us, you have to essentially, I mean, he didn't say it in these words, but you have to pay us to ensure that it remains peaceful. And that corresponds with changes we've seen in the rhetoric of other regime officials. Araghchi, I've sat with him, I've spoken with him. He's a person who chooses his words carefully. So I don't think this is an accident. And it gets to this point that I made before and that Matt echoed, as they have gotten closer, as the regime has gotten closer to the threshold of nuclear weapons, they've become bolder not just in their actions, but also in their rhetoric. And I'm sure they're going to be bolder in terms of what they demand at the negotiating table as well as we go forward.
Thank you. And Mike, I know I'm cognizant of time, and I know you may have to leave soon, so I just want to try and get you to answer a few more things. You lead the Washington Institute's efforts to study great power competition, and Matt, you've recently authored a book on the subject. I believe it's called We Win, They Lose. What can you both tell us about Iran's increasing ties with Russia and China, and what it may afford the regime in the nuclear space, as well as what the changing geopolitical situation with Washington may mean for Moscow and Beijing for nuclear nonproliferation?
I think this is the biggest change in the international security landscape over the past few years. If you look back even to the Biden national security strategy that was just released about 2 years ago, it talks about Russia, China, Iran, North Korea as challenges, but doesn't really talk much about the interlinkages. I think what we're seeing clearly now, especially after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, is that there is this kind of new axis of autocracies. Russia, China, Iran, North Korea working together more closely. So we see joint military exercises, joint weapons production. We see Iran providing drones to Russia, China fueling Russia's war effort, North Korea providing munitions to Russia. And I do think it has implications for the nuclear program. I think it's very unlikely that we're going to get Russia and China to be tough again on Iran in the UN Security Council over its nuclear program. Maybe harder, surprising maybe that, just 10 years or so ago, we did think of Russia and China as partners for countering Iran's nuclear program. I think now they're going to back off. And then what is Russia providing Iran in exchange for the drones? Are they maybe providing technical assistance helpful to Iran's nuclear program? That's something I worry about. So then what does this mean for U.S. strategy? And Mike is right, you do have some people in Washington now saying, well, we need to focus on China, nothing else matters. And I think this new axis of autocracy show that doesn't make sense. I think the United States and its allies do need a strategy that can deal with Russia, China, Iran, North Korea at the same time. There was recently a National Defense Strategy Commission report co-chaired by Eric Edelman and Jane Harman that, I forget the exact term, but something like a multi-theater plan is what the United States needs, and I think that's right. So I think it would be a mistake to say we're doing China, not Iran anymore. We need to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time.
Thank you.
I agree with that. I would just say that, this cooperation we see between Russia and Iran, between China and Iran, is not new. They have cooperated with one another for many decades. I think what's new is, first and foremost, China's rising economic and military might makes Chinese help to Iran much more concerning and much more effective, in a sense, from a U.S. standpoint. So go back 10, 15 years, when the U.S. was the world's largest importer of oil, China wasn't in a position to rescue Iran in the way that it is now by purchasing Iranian oil. Now China has that ability. And now China is certainly not inclined in the way that it was in the past to be as cooperative with the United States. So, back in 2005 when we created the P5+1, we got the cooperation of both Russia and China, not because necessarily, first and foremost, their relationship with Iran was different, but because their relationship with the United States was different, and the power dynamics in the world were different. So China has risen, has more openly challenging the United States, and one way to do that is by supporting a state like Iran, which is being targeted by American sanctions and so forth. The other interesting change is Iran's own sort of growth and capabilities. And so you've seen the Russia-Iran dynamic in a way flip, something which I'm sure gives, frankly, many Iranians no end of satisfaction. Because now you have Iran providing drones and missiles to Russia. In the past, it was the opposite. Now we can be sure, and we were talking about this earlier today, that Russia is providing something to Iran in return. And what that may be is very concerning. The U.S. government says it's nuclear cooperation or cooperation on space. We should be concerned about those things. We should want to know more about those things, frankly. But there's no doubt that Iran is helping Russia sustain its war machine in Ukraine. And this is something that 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we never really would have imagined. We saw Iran as a state that was largely, projecting asymmetric power, supporting terrorist groups, but we wouldn't have seen it as a state that could help Russia with its conventional military strength. So the dynamics inside that group have changed. The dynamics in the world have changed. And so this partnership amongst whatever you want to call them, U.S. adversaries for sure, is increasingly, I think, a worry and something that we need to address as a matter of our policy.
Just a footnote to that. Nothing the Islamic Republic does abroad is divorced from these two forces, which is status and security. And Mike is absolutely right to talk about how much joy it gives the officials of the Islamic Republic who in the early 1990s, after they were rebuilding after the Iran-Iraq war, had a whole host of delayed contracts from the Russians. The Iranians saw the speed at which the S-300 and the S-400 was deployed to Syria, but it was about a 15-year delay for them vis-a-vis the Russians to get this surface-to-air system. So they're enjoying it, but also they're getting something from it. There was a video that surfaced at the beginning of the Ukraine war, dating back to right before the pandemic in 2019, Iran's Aerospace Force Commander Hajizadeh meeting with his Russian counterpart, and he's basically shaking hands with him saying, I'll help you set up a drone command, you help me with my space command. And so it's literally a transactional partnership that is moving into the transformational period. And the problem with that is Washington still sees it not even as just transactional, or now has finally caught up to being transactional, but there's still a whole host of voices in the conventional wisdom of Washington that see exactly what you and I know, the 500-year enmity between Iran and Russia, and they say, oh no, these guys have turbulent transactions, they can never quarantine or compartmentalize their rivalry to work together. Well, guess what? They can, and they have been. Look, the Iranians and the Russians didn't see eye to eye on the tactical stuff in Syria, but they learned a lot lot from operating close enough together, and that was a welding tool for their partnership. There's still people who think that the Russians or the Chinese would sell the Iranians out for the right price. I think that's 2010 wisdom. Russia and China signed up, you're right, to all of those UN Security Council resolutions that said no reprocessing, no enrichment, permanent ballistic missile testing ban, permanent arms transfer ban. But that was 2010, and now this is 2024. And I think our adversaries are a lot better at fleshing out that middle part of the Venn diagram and working towards a least common denominator approach. And we, for some reason, when we have an issue with one of our partners, be it in the region or around the world, we amp up or we flesh up those differences. And I just think we need to be a bit better about compartmentalizing a lot of the problems and the prospects that we face, because unfortunately our authoritarian axis that's facing us, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, they're quite good at pushing down on what would be an impediment to their relationship and amping up what would allow them to build it. We know in exchange for the drones, they've gotten gold, they've gotten cash, they've gotten captured Western weapons. And my fear on this space thing is, Iran already has, as Matt just said, the biggest ballistic missile program in the region. Just like they've weaponized the threshold status for the nuclear, for years they've weaponized the range ban on the ballistic missiles, saying if the Europeans don't behave, we'll expand the range of our missiles. And the space program is something that gives them great cover to be able to advance those technologies without getting the reciprocal penalties. I mean, it's good news that the UK and the US finally, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, sanctioned the head of the IRGC space program. But I would say that came about 7 or 10 years too late. So the threat is fast evolving. And I think right now we have to forecast, is it the nuclear direction? Is it the conventional arms direction? Is it the sanctions busting and de-dollarization direction? What are the areas that this relationship could go? And we have to be developing those offsets right now so that when it happens, we're not caught with our pants down.
Thank you. Just along those lines also, the nuclear program in Iran has faced cyber attacks before, such as the Stuxnet virus, which targeted its enrichment facilities. How do you guys, as an added measure to sanctions, how do each of you feel cyber operations fit into the broader strategy of preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons?
So I can start, and I'd say I think it's an important component, but on its own it won't be enough. I think over the years you've sometimes had people who think that, well, we can use cyber, we can use sabotage, and that will allow us to avoid the really hard decisions like might we have to use military force someday. And I think what we've seen, even after Stuxnet, if you look at the trend lines in Iran's enrichment program and IAEA reports, its number of centrifuges increased, the sophistication of the centrifuges, the stockpiles of low-enriched uranium. So I think their progress probably would have been faster if it hadn't been for some of the cyber and sabotage and other things. But I think we also saw that Iran continued to make progress nonetheless. So I think it should be a component, but we also shouldn't fool ourselves and think that we can just sprinkle some magic cyber dust and fix this problem.
I think Matt is right about that. I think you have to think about alongside the traditional policy measures we think about, like sanctions, stopping the regime from benefiting from oil sales, the idea of credible military threats, which we've talked about, diplomacy. You have to have a parallel effort to try to delay and obstruct a missile program or a nuclear program. And there's a number of ways you do that. Cyber is one tool to do that. But another tool that is less trendy but equally important and we don't talk about enough are simple export control restrictions, trying to stop key components from flowing to Iran that it might use for, say, a missile program. I think it's very important that we re-energize these types of efforts, as we see, for example, Iran providing missiles and drones to Russia. There is a supply chain behind those items, just as there's a supply chain behind Iran's nuclear program. And it requires immense effort at gathering intelligence and then acting through partners to try to disrupt that supply chain. The cyber element of it, or the covert operations element of it, is the one that often gets the attention. Look at the pager and walkie-talkie operation that Israel did in Lebanon. A very effective operation, one which will cause Hezbollah and Iran, frankly, to have to now re-examine their supply chains and will slow things down. but one which is a one-off ultimately. And what you need is a multi-year sort of campaign of efforts to obstruct a missile program, a nuclear program, in parallel with the kind of bigger elements of policy aimed at sort of solving the problem, quote unquote.
Just, I'll be cognizant of time on cyber. It's one of the ingredients in the cocktail. It's not the defining ingredient, in my view. But it's also, just because it's not the defining ingredient doesn't mean it's the one that you should give up. I mean, look at what the Islamic Republic of Iran is doing to the U.S. homeland when it comes to cyber. Hacking hospitals, hacking critical infrastructure, dams, other kind of water treatment facilities. This is what the Islamic Republic of Iran is doing to the U.S. homeland using this domain. So I think in this domain, there needs to be an equal and opposite response, totally just independent of the nuclear issue, to use the cyber domain to shape the regime's risk-reward calculus and thinking about what it can do and what it can get away with and what it can't get away with. So I think just broad strokes, that's number one. Specifically tied to the nuclear issue, I think it's just one of the many tools that, the fancy technical word is shaping, to shape their calculus, but really I think you want to use cyber to handicap them. You want to use sabotage to handicap them. You want to use sanctions to handicap them. Because like we said in the beginning, the Islamic Republic of Iran has had a consistent foreign and security policy. They are punching at you like a boxer. What these tools independently do, cyber, sanctions, sabotage, kinetic action, what have you. What these tools do is at a minimum, it ties one of this boxer's hands behind its back.
Thank you, all three of you. I have 3 or 4 more questions, but I know that I think our time is up, and I wanted to open it up to maybe one question from the audience.
We have one question that's directed towards Behnam. It says, given the fact that we cannot trust the official data from the Islamic Republic for its nuclear activities to monitor their activities, do you think the U.S. should take more serious measures to stop the illegal and underground testing?
Well, data is a big problem, and that's actually where the monitoring and verification mission of the International Atomic Energy Agency kicks in. I think in terms of monitoring and verification and testing, you meant the nuclear program, maybe not on the missile or military. We can have a conversation related to that after. But this is where we have to make sure the U.S. and all of the U.S.'s partners, full stop, have the support and backing and can give political cover to the International Atomic Energy Agency to do its job with respect to trying to monitor and verify the scale and scope of Iran's program. Some of you may not know, I think it's been a little over a year and a half, the Islamic Republic has been denying even visas to IAEA inspectors from Western-friendly countries just to hamper and impede this monitoring and verification mission. So yes, the data is critical, absolutely. We cannot take the Islamic Republic of Iran at its word. They've hampered these folks' monitoring and verification mission on the ground. They put political pressure on the teams when they're back in Vienna, and now they're limiting their activities in Iran by limiting the number of visas. So I think step number one is, if you do believe in peaceful means of conflict adjudication, you have to make sure that all of your diplomatic tools are back to the hilt. And I think the U.S. has left the field, and I'll put it politely, when it comes to making sure it stands wholeheartedly with the IAEA. I think the fact that it took 18 months to get a resolution of censure, that's a big problem. The fact that the Europeans, per the Wall Street Journal reporting earlier this summer, are to America's right at the IAEA is a big problem. And so yes, don't take the Iranians at their word when it comes to data. Get independent monitoring and verification, and make sure that that agency is resourced and has the political capital it needs to accomplish its mission.
Thank you. Thank you to our amazing panel for today's insightful discussion. Thank you for all your insight and your knowledge. We appreciate you. And thank you to Mufti again for everything you do day in, day out, for these wonderful conferences that you put together that are so much work and it takes so much effort from all of you at Mufti. We thank you. We appreciate you. Please keep it going.